So yesterday I was showing you my spice collection and how I organize it. I've got my 2 jars that I decided to free up yesterday, and I've decided to put some celery seeds and black mustard seeds in these jars. It can be better to do this using a funnel or just a piece of kind of rolled paper, but I'm just living dangerously. It also occurred to me yesterday that I didn't really talk about a lot of the spices that I have. So I thought I might pick out just a couple of things to talk about today. Celery seeds was a new one for me. I bought them, if you watch my other vlog, you'll have seen that I experimented with pickling cucumbers, which I was growing up on my roof. And celery seeds was something that was in the recipe for pickled cucumbers that I made. I also had a thought about my mystery spice, which is this one that I was talking about yesterday. I wonder if it's mixed spice, which I have used in the past for baking, for making Chelsea buns and things like that. And that's, I think, a mixture of cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. I think that's what it might be. So I'm just going to write that on the top. So yeah, I think I've solved one mystery. Let's just get my mustard seeds in here. That's 2 bags that I can throw away now. One more that I brought out to show you today. This is chipotle, which is a kind of staple of Mexican cooking. And it's a smoked chili powder. It's so delicious. They're probably all quite different. This one I have is really, really hot, so you have to be a bit careful not to use too much, but the smoky smell and flavour is absolutely incredible. If you've never cooked with chipotle, I really recommend it. I'll have to find a recipe to show you where I use this so that I can kind of talk about it a bit more. Oh, it just smells incredible. And the other thing I pulled out is this. I've got this little jar of seaweed, dried seaweed, and it's like, I don't know if you can see that, it's like that. I have experience of using seaweed like the nori sheets, but I've never been entirely sure what I should do with this. So I thought I would just show it and say if anyone has any recipes where you use dried seaweed like this. I'm sure there are some kind of like soupy type things, ramen-y type things where I could use it. But if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Today what I'm making is a dessert for my birthday. It's a coffee crème caramel. Now I call these flans because in Mexico flan is a sort of crème caramel dessert. But in the UK flan usually means something else. It means like a fruit pie kind of thing, which I'm not that keen on. So I'm worried about calling it flan because in the UK that usually means something else. So I'll stick with crème caramel, which is probably more familiar to UK people, Europeans. And this is a coffee version. I've made flan or crème caramel many, many times because it's one of Sergio's favourite things to eat. And I've made them different ways. You always see different advice for making caramel and stuff, and caramel can be a bit tricky. And this one is new to me because it's coffee flavoured, so it'll be interesting to try it out. And I think it's a caramel method I haven't tried before, so we'll see how it goes. Caramel's always slightly scary because it can crystallise. You can overdo it as it starts to turn brown. You've got to kind of leave it long enough that it has really good flavour, but not long enough that it burns. So it's always a little bit stressful. In this pan I'm bringing to a gentle simmer some whole milk, sugar, ground coffee, some vanilla extract and a strip of lemon zest. I'm just going to bring this to a low simmer and then I'll take it off the heat, put a lid on, and it's just going to sit and infuse for half an hour. I'm supposed to pass my infused milk through a fine mesh strainer, which I don't have. I actually broke ours, so I'm going to try straining it through a coffee filter instead. So let's see how it goes. Here's my coffee infused milk and sugar mixture. The coffee filter straining didn't really work out because I think because milk has more of a thick consistency, it doesn't pass through like water does, so it kind of went into the filter and just sat there. But luckily, pouring it back out of the filter, most of the coffee grains kind of stuck to the filter anyway, so that got a lot of the coffee grains out. And also what I then did, the finest mesh thing that I have in my kitchen is actually a kind of spatter guard for when you're frying things, which has a very fine mesh, but it's also flat, so it's hard to use it to strain things through. But I ended up using that, plus a little funnel. So I put the mesh on top of here flat, and I used a little funnel and poured the milk in just a little bit at a time, which allowed me to direct it through the mesh into the bowl. So yeah, I managed to finally strain out my coffee grounds here. And now I'm going to move on to the next stage, which is to make the caramel. So I've also got the oven preheating to 160. This recipe is actually for one large creme caramel, but when I make it I usually use these ramekins and make small individual portion ones, so I am going to do the small ones. I don't really have a suitable thing to bake a large one in. So this involves adjusting the cooking time, but because I've made flattened many times before, I'm kind of familiar with how long it takes for this size, so I'm just going to go with that. It's important to get the dish or the ramekins, whatever you're cooking it in, ready when you make the caramel, so that when the caramel's exactly right, you can pour it in and line the dishes with it straight away. For this caramel method, I'm putting sugar, water and a little bit of lemon juice in a pan over the heat, and stirring very vigorously until the sugar is completely dissolved, and then stopping stirring, because when you make caramel it's kind of important that at a certain point that you don't move the mixture in the pan too much, because that can cause the crystallization. That means you have to start again. But with this one you stir it quite vigorously at first to get the sugar dissolving, so I'm going to try this and see how it goes. So yeah, I've got my sugar to dissolve. The way to tell that it's dissolved is that when you first combine water and sugar in a pan, it'll be a very cloudy liquid. So you keep stirring over a medium heat until the liquid becomes completely sort of transparent again. That's the point where your sugar's dissolved and you have to stop moving it around. So I'm going to keep my eye on it. I've increased the heat slightly and I just have to watch it now until the colour starts to change to the classic kind of brown caramel colour. Even though I'm not stirring anymore, the recipe suggests swirling the pan briefly every few minutes as you wait for it to darken. In this recipe they describe the colour that you're looking for in the caramel as deep mahogany. So yeah, the darker brown it goes, the more flavour you have, but also once it browns it can burn very fast, so you have to keep watching. It can seem quite boring at first because you're just standing staring at a pan, but it's risky to turn your back for too long. Right, so my first caramel didn't darken at all and I had to do it again. When I reread the recipe I realised I'd used twice as much water as I should have, because I'm kind of halving everything and I'd forgotten to halve that one, so that was why. So I did it again and it was a little bit touch and go, but it eventually worked. Here are my caramel lined ramekins. I realised while I was trying to make it work, I googled what was my caramel method last time I cooked, and it's actually the Delia Smith caramel method. So if you're making caramel at any point and you're having trouble, try that one, because that's what's worked for me in the past. And in that method you don't add any water with the sugar at all, you just put sugar, that's it, in a pan, and you heat it until it kind of browns around the edges, and that's always worked well for me, so that's what I was going to try next if my second one didn't work. So my next thing is to add some eggs to this milk, reheat it, add eggs, make it into a custard. Then these are going to go into the oven in a sort of bain-marie, so in a tray of hot water, and I'll show you that in a second. Yeah, so now I'm going to reheat my coffee milk mixture until it's steaming hot, whisk these eggs slightly and then pour them into the hot milk and make a custard. And I have already strained my coffee and milk mixture, but I'm going to strain the custard one more time once the eggs have been added, and then pour the strained custard into these pots here. Now I'm going to pour boiling water into the tray about halfway up the edges of the ramekins and then get them into the oven. When I've made these small flans before, they've taken about half an hour in the oven, so that's what I'm going to try this time. This recipe also specifies that you should, once you take them out of the oven, leave them sitting in the hot water bath for another half hour, I think. So I'm going to try that. When I've made these before, I've made the kind of custard in two different ways. There's the way making it with eggs, which is what I've done today, but there's another recipe I've done with no eggs, but instead of milk you use a mixture of condensed and evaporated milk, which is much thicker, so perhaps you don't need the eggs if you use that method. And they're both delicious, so I don't really have a preference. So yeah, now I'm just excited to see if these come out okay. Yeah, I just checked, it's 30 minutes that they should stay sitting in the hot water once they're out of the oven. After that, they're going to go in the fridge for a minimum of 4 hours, but they can be in there for a day or two. And then you eat them cold. Getting them out of the ramekins is another kind of drama, which hopefully I'll come back tomorrow and show you that. Usually I just slide a very sharp knife around the edges and then shake it onto a plate a few times and it comes out fine. So hopefully that will happen this time. The only other thing to talk about is the recipe says the way to tell when they're kind of the right consistency to come out of the oven is if you shake the pan a little bit. There should be a little bit of wobble right in the very centre of the creme caramel. So that's what I'm going to be looking for in half an hour. The recipe I'm using for a sort of one large flan says to cook for an hour and a half, which seems like very long to me. It is a low temperature, it's 160. So I'm going to check in half an hour, but I guess I'm anticipating they might need slightly longer. We'll see. It's day 2 of making my coffee creme caramel. I've actually taken one out of the mould already. Everything turned out really, really well, even the things I was a little worried about, apart from the visuals of it. Because I think what's happened was that I didn't fully filter out all the little bits of coffee granules. The recipe calls for using whole coffee beans and then kind of roughly chopping them to infuse the milk, and I think that makes it easier to ensure that when you strain the milk and the custard, all of that comes out. So I've been left with quite a lot of little tiny coffee particles, which have kind of during the cooking come to the outside of the flan, which kind of really doesn't look very appealing when you first see it. The flavour of them and the texture is absolutely amazing, so I'm definitely going to try making it again. But yeah, they just don't look super appetizing with the coffee granules kind of in the caramel and on the outside of the flan. But I'm going to take these two here out of the ramekins now, so you can see how you do that. And what I'll do is I'll do a follow-up video another time using whole coffee beans and see if I can get them to look a bit more attractive as well as tasting good. But it is interesting. I mean, I was worried about the cooking time and the texture of them. I ended up cooking them for 40 minutes, which seemed to work perfectly. The texture's really good, probably better than the last time I made these. So it's just the appearance that could be improved. So that's something I can work on. So here you can kind of see what I'm talking about, that some of the smallest little pieces of coffee granules are kind of still there, and they've kind of stained the outside of the flan and the caramel,
But once you cut into the middle, it's kind of really good smooth texture inside, and those coffee granules aren't there. So I know that if I do it again and I manage to find a way to not have bits of coffee in there, that it'll be really good. And the taste of these is amazing. The kind of bitterness of the coffee helps counteract how sweet the caramel is. So definitely going to do these again and just try and improve the appearance. It's time to remake my coffee creme caramel, and this time I'm doing everything properly. I'm using whole coffee beans, which here I've kind of coarsely ground, a strip of lemon zest, and because I don't have vanilla pods, I'm just using vanilla extract there. And that's going to go into my milk in a second and make the infusion. And look what I have now, amazing. A really fine strainer, so I should have no trouble getting these pieces out of the milk once it's infused. So now it's time to make the caramel for my second attempt at the coffee creme caramel. I made my coffee infused milk yesterday actually, left it in the fridge overnight, which hopefully won't affect anything. It seems fine, and there's a lot less sediment in there than there was last time thanks to my new strainer, so that's good. Last time the caramel caused me a little bit of bother, so we're going to see if I can do it right first time this time. One thing I've figured out is how to make a good quantity to just make 2 of these creme caramel, because sometimes with these recipes I end up with kind of 7 of them, which is a lot more than my partner and I really want to eat, and they don't last very long. So I'm glad I figured out quantities to just make 2. That's useful information. And now I'm going to attempt the caramel. This time I want to try and be a little bit braver with it. Last time I think I stopped it slightly too soon. The classic creme caramel has this very pale custard part and then the lovely caramel colour on the top. Because this is kind of an infused custard, it's a little darker than usual. So I think it will help if the caramel itself is a little darker as well. So I'm going to be a bit brave and see if I can leave it to the point when it's got a really good deep colour this time. Looks like we have a little colour starting in here. Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to wait till this is kind of mahogany brown, as the recipe says, and try not to rush it too much. It's definitely getting darker now. Better put this down and get ready to pour it. I am much happier with the colour this time round. That's definitely a kind of darker mahogany type caramel than I had last time. So a couple of thoughts on caramel, having just done it twice in a short space of time. This recipe is that you stir sugar and water syrup together over a kind of medium to low heat until all the sugar is dissolved and the water turns clear, the syrup turns clear, and that takes about 5 minutes. The aim is to get that dissolving process to happen before the syrup starts to boil, because at the point it starts to boil, it's turning to caramel quite rapidly, and it won't turn to caramel if you've let it boil before the sugar is fully dissolved. Now, my experience of trying this is that twice I've sort of slowly heated it for 5 minutes, stirring constantly, and it hasn't gone transparent at all. It stayed really cloudy. I've had the sense that the sugar is dissolving, is almost kind of fully dissolved, but it's still been really cloudy, so I haven't been sure when to stop stirring. And then what's happened is that it's just started to boil, so I've stopped stirring, and even though it's been really cloudy, it has made caramel fine both times. So I guess that's something, if you're going to try this exact recipe, to look out for. And as I said before when I made this last time, if you're having trouble getting caramel to work, try the Delia Smith method, which is just sugar in a pan. There's no water, no lemon juice. I've had success with that as well in the past, so that's one to try. And if you're making caramel for the first time, don't freak out when you've finished and your pan seems to be coated in like a caramel cement. It seems like it's going to be impossible to clean to begin with, but if you just leave it to soak in water, it comes off absolutely fine. I found that I'd actually made too much caramel. I'll adjust the quantities in my recipe accordingly. And I poured, this is an experiment, I poured the spare just onto a piece of greaseproof paper so that I can just eat it. So now that I've got my caramel and it's a lovely colour, I'm going to complete making the custard and get them into the bain-marie, into the oven. And what I'm doing now is again heating the custard through. I've got beaten eggs ready to stir into that when it's hot. That'll all get poured on top of here and it'll go into the oven in a water bath. I'm so happy with how these creme caramel are looking. I realised that there was one other thing to say about them, which is that when you put the water into the baking dish, you've got to then be careful that you don't either slop water into the ramekins or slop the custard out of the ramekins into the water when you're transferring into the oven. Some people put the ramekins in the dish, put it in the oven and then pour water in through something with a small spout if you have something like that. So I just put the water in and then transfer to the oven. And I'm just really careful not to kind of spill anything. Just enjoying a chunk of sugar here. These came out so much better than last time. Definitely got none of the issues of the coffee granules kind of clouding the sides. Even though I was much happier with the way my flan looked the second time around, there's still something I want to try, so I'm going to make them a third time. I'm not usually this perfectionist, but I just felt like because I want to do the recipe on the vlog, I want to make sure I've tried everything to make it as good as possible before I share it with you guys. So the appearance was much better obviously, but there were a lot of the little kind of air bubbles around the edges. Now, the chef that wrote the recipe she said, I always get air bubbles around the edges. There's not much you can do about it and it's absolutely fine. But then again, you do see these videos of really gorgeous flan with really smooth sides. I'm not anticipating being able to get them perfect, but I have been reading about how you can have fewer air bubbles. One thing to try is cooking them at a slightly lower temperature. Some people say that the air bubbles come because it starts to boil before it's set. The other thing people talk about is that when you mix together the custard that you pour into the ramekins on top of the caramel layer, some people recommend that before you pour it into the ramekins, you leave it to just sit for about half an hour or so to let the kind of air come out of the mixture after you've sort of whisked it together. That seems to make a lot of sense to me, and it just felt like something I wanted to try. And there was one other thing I wanted to kind of try and resolve, which is the last few times I've made the flans, I found them really hard to turn out of the ramekins. They're always a little bit tough. You have to kind of shake and bang them for a while before they kind of come out. But I've never tried sort of buttering the inside of the ramekins, and I've seen recipes that recommend that. So I'm going to try making them one more time. Trying greasing the inside of the ramekins and also letting the custard mixture kind of sit to let the air come out, and also maybe cooking them at a slightly lower temperature. I think the first time I made them, the consistency was a little smoother. It was really perfect. The second time they looked better. The consistency was maybe slightly less smooth. So I'm hoping that the third time I'll get both things absolutely right. Just wanted to update you on some of my caramel experiments that have been happening over the last day or two. It started when I tried to refine my quantities of caramel to suit just making a very small, like 2 small flans. And I found it really hard to get proportions right when reducing the amount in the recipe. I had a couple of disastrous attempts at caramel, did some more research, and have finally had a successful one today. So I've got 2 here that are ready to go in the oven in a minute. I've made my custard again, and as I mentioned before, I'm letting this sit now for at least 15-20 minutes so that all the air can kind of leave that mixture. I'm then going to very gently pour it into here before putting it in the oven and baking it at a lower temperature than before, about 140, to see if I can get a smoother consistency in the finished flan. So yeah, the caramel disasters. First of all, I found out that the 2 different methods I've been describing, they're just called wet and dry caramel. There's one where you just heat up sugar on its own, that's the Delia Smith method. That's called dry, obviously, because you're not adding any water. And the method that's in this recipe that I've been doing here is wet. The reason I prefer wet is I think the finished caramel has a kind of much smoother consistency. It's easier to pour. It's really, really smooth. It doesn't kind of crack. When I did the Delia Smith one, I poured it in here and it would sometimes come out so thick it was hard to get it to fill the bottom of the ramekin, and it would also kind of crack as it cooled, and this just seems to be a lot smoother. So the first time I did this and it was successful, I thought, brilliant, I found a caramel recipe that I love and it works really well. The issues did come with trying to reduce the quantities. I mean, the recipe was in cups, and then cups are different depending on whether you're talking about a liquid water or a solid sugar, so it was all a bit of a nightmare. I finally figured out a good way to do it is that you basically want to put a quarter of the volume of sugar into the pan as water. So today, to make a small amount, I did 4 tablespoons of sugar and 1 tablespoon of water and a couple of drops of lemon juice, and that worked really well. So yeah, I've got over yesterday's traumas now, where I had 2 failed attempts. Both times I think I was using too much water, it was too wet and it never kind of came together. I also learned that you can actually cut your finger on caramel, that was a new one for me. So these are ready to go in the oven now. The third thing I'm changing on this attempt, so we've got letting this custard rest for a bit before it goes in. We've got a slightly lower oven temperature. The third thing is that I'm going to lightly butter the insides of these before I put this in, to see if that makes getting them out at the end any easier. Right, here are my creme caramel from yesterday. Let's see if the butter made any difference to how easy they are to get out. I definitely think that cooking at 10 degrees lower made a massive difference to the consistency. The second time I made them, when they came out the oven, they were really domed, which means I think they got too hot inside, and these came out fairly flat, and they were lovely and kind of jiggly. So now I'm going to run the knife around the edge. I'm not sure that the butter made a lot of difference. I could see that a lot of the butter just kind of mixed in with the custard when I poured it in and didn't really stay on the edge. But let's have a look. Perhaps just the softer consistency will help make them easy to take out as well. No, they definitely don't seem to be any easier to take out, which is annoying. There we go, you can usually hear when it kind of releases. Ooh. Okay, so still some air bubbles, but all in all, much, much smoother, and I think that will be smoother to eat as well. Actually, that one came out really, really smoothly. Oh, so now I don't know what to think. The caramel's a little lighter this time, which was intentional. Even though it had a good colour last time, it had a slightly kind of burnt flavour, which is not what you want. I think this caramel is pretty perfect. And yeah, I still do have the bubbles on the side, but I can kind of tell already that the consistency is going to be a little less rubbery and a little smoother to eat. Yeah, I'm really happy with how these came out this time. There was one other thing that I forgot to try, which was slightly annoying, but I might try this next time I make them, which is to line the inside of the baking tray with a folded kitchen towel, which apparently helps prevent such fierce heat kind of on the underside of the ramekins. So I think I'll definitely try that next time. But yeah, I couldn't be happy with these. They just look like they have exactly the right, really soft, kind of creamy consistency. It made me think of something else I wanted to say as well, which is that sometimes people are scared of baking, and it's true that you can have some disasters with baking. But quite often, even if things don't go to plan, they still come out perfectly edible and tasty. 2 examples recently. 2 friends of mine have done different baking projects where they, at certain points during the process, thought that they had ruined the bread or the pastry or whatever it was they were making, thought it was going to turn out rubbish, and it actually didn't. Turned out perfectly fine. One turned out brilliantly, the other one didn't look great but was delicious to eat. And I've always found that with my baking anytime something's gone wrong, it's very rare that I've had something that's just gone in the bin. So it's definitely worth not being scared of baking and having a go, and not being too disappointed if something doesn't turn out perfect the first time. You can always do what I did, which was remake it a few times, trying different things, do some research online and see what people suggest. But yeah, even if you make something that doesn't look that beautiful, it's still a fun process. Still end up with something really tasty. Even when these end up kind of rubbery, they're still absolutely delicious. I mean, it's smothered in caramel, so and that's something I read on a lot of websites, was people saying, yeah, people try and get this perfect smooth consistency, but it really doesn't matter that much. I mean, it's still delicious however it turns out. So yeah, give baking a go if you don't already bake, and don't be too worried if things look like they might be going wrong or don't quite look as pretty as you hoped. That's just something that can give you motivation to try it again and keep doing it and seeing whether you can kind of make improvements each time.